She told him to let her die. He saved her and made her dinner instead. A story of human stubbornness and alien pride. I found her in the wreckage at 3:47 local time, which meant I'd been awake for 22 hours and had exactly 0 patience left for complications. The crash site wasn't supposed to have survivors. Station control had already written off the freighter, a mid-size Velhari hauler, name stenciled on the crumpled hull in a script I couldn't read, as a total loss before the debris field had even finished raining down across Sector 9's transit corridor. I was only out here because it was my rotation on salvage survey, and salvage survey is a very polished phrase for go poke through wreckage and make sure nothing's going to drift into the shipping lane and kill someone later. I was not supposed to find a living alien in the middle of it. She was pinned under a collapsed bulkhead, not deeply, not lethally, but firmly enough that she couldn't free herself. Her suit had a tear along the left shoulder seam that her body's own biology was already sealing with some kind of reactive membrane, the purple-blue color of a bruise spreading, and then hardening into something almost like scar tissue in real time. Her 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern across a face that was narrow and sharp-featured, more avian than mammalian by human reckoning, were all open, all focused, all looking directly at me with an expression I'd learned to read as furious and in pain, but refusing to show either. I keyed my translation module. "I'm going to get you out," I said. "Do not bother," she said. I paused. My translation module rendered her voice as a low, clipped contralto, with the particular cadence of someone who is used to giving orders in a professional context and was now applying that cadence to giving orders in a dying context. "I'm sorry." I said, "Do not bother." She said it again with the patient emphasis of someone repeating something to a person who is clearly slow. "My suit seal is compromised. My secondary circulatory system has already collapsed. If you attempt to move me without proper medical support, you will accelerate the tissue failure rather than prevent it. The mathematics do not favor intervention. Leave me, salvager." "Your name," I said, because if I was going to argue with her, I needed something to call her. "Irrelevant. I'm going to keep calling you Hey You, until you give me something better, and I feel like you're the kind of person who would find that extremely irritating." A long pause. All 4 eyes blinked in an asymmetric sequence that my translation module flagged as either extreme irritation or extreme consideration, possibly both. "Verath," she said. "Lieutenant Commander Verath, Velhari Merchant Navy, retired. And you are wasting my time." "Marcus," I said. "Marcus Webb, Station 9 salvage contractor, not retired, and I'm not leaving you here." "You should." "I know, I'm going to anyway. Here is what I want you to understand about the Velhari before I tell you the rest of this. They are not a species that responds well to being saved. They have a concept in their culture. I learned the word later. Verath eventually taught it to me with the tone of someone explaining something to a particularly dense child, called *Verathka*, which my module renders as something between dignity of the concluded and the right to an ending that belongs to you. It's not exactly suicide as humans understand it. It's more nuanced than that. It's the idea that there is a kind of grace in accepting what the mathematics say is inevitable, and that fighting against it past the point of reasonable hope is not cowardly, exactly, but undignified, messy, an imposition on those who have to watch. Verath had decided, with the cold precision of a retired naval officer who had spent 40 years calculating acceptable losses, that her situation qualified. I, on the other hand, had spent my formative years watching my grandmother refuse to die from 3 separate things that should have killed her, including, memorably, a combined harvester incident that I'm still not entirely clear on the details of, and had developed a deep, bone-level distrust of the phrase, "The mathematics don't favor intervention." My grandmother's response to mathematics was to tell mathematics to mind its own business. I came by my stubbornness honestly. Getting Verath free of the bulkhead took 40 minutes, a portable hydraulic lift I should not technically have had on a survey vessel, and a series of creative applications of cargo strapping that I'm fairly sure voided several equipment warranties. She told me 4 separate times during this process to stop. I did not stop. When I finally got her onto the portable stretcher and started moving toward my ship, she said, with the particular flat exhaustion of someone who has lost an argument they were certain they would win, "You are either very brave or very stupid." "People keep saying that like it's one or the other," I said. "My personal theory is it's mostly neither. I just really don't like leaving things unfinished." "I am not a thing." "No, you're a person, and I like leaving people unfinished even less." Silence for a moment, then, "Your ship has medical capability." "Basic trauma suite, enough." "Define enough." "Enough to get you stable enough to transfer to a proper medical facility." "Probably." "Probably," she repeated. "The alternative is definitely," I said. "You want to go back to definitely." She didn't answer that. I took it as a win. My ship is called the Asterisk Secondhand. This is because I bought it secondhand, which I thought was a funny joke when I named it, and which I have since grown to merely tolerate. It is not a large ship or a particularly impressive ship, but it is a competent ship, and I have learned to appreciate competence over impressiveness as I've gotten older. The medical suite was designed for human biology, which meant I spent the first hour running every cross-species compatibility scan in my database, while Verath lay on the examination table and watched me with the particular expression of someone reassessing their initial judgment. Not favorably necessarily, just reassessing. "You're going to tell me this equipment isn't designed for Velhari," she said. "Yep." "Then you cannot." "I'm working on it." I pulled up the cross-reference database, then the emergency medical protocols, then the third database I kept that was a personal compilation of stuff that has worked on non-humans in a pinch, sourced from salvage workers and station medics, and one extremely knowledgeable black market pharmacist on Korath Station, who I owe a considerable favor. It was not an official database. It was absolutely the most useful one I had. "Your secondary circulatory system. Is that the one using the copper-based carrier proteins, or the one using the manganese-based ones?" The silence was different this time, slightly surprised. "Copper," she said. "You know Velhari biology." "I know enough about enough things to be dangerous. The suit wound on your shoulder, the reactive membrane sealing it. Is that going to cause problems if I apply a standard tissue adhesive underneath it, or is it independent?" "Independent." A pause. "The adhesive will need to be neutral pH. Acidic compounds will degrade the membrane." "Neutral pH, got it." I was already pulling the right kit. "Temperature preference for the environment. I know Velhari run cooler than humans." 18 degrees centigrade is comfortable. "I'll take it down to 20. The medical equipment gets finicky below that." "Compromise." She looked at me for a long moment, all 4 eyes, that diamond pattern, tracking in that slightly offset way that I'd already started to find oddly compelling. "You are negotiating with me about my own treatment." "I'm negotiating with you about the treatment environment. There's a difference. Your treatment I'm going to do right regardless." I met her eyes, or at least 2 of the 4, which felt like the best I could manage. "I'm not asking your permission to save your life, Verath. I'm asking your input so I do it better. There's a difference there too." Another long pause. 20 degrees, she said. "Acceptable." It took 6 hours. I want to be clear about what those 6 hours involved, because I think it's important not to romanticize it. It was 6 hours of painstaking, improvised, frequently profane medical work using equipment not designed for the patient in question, cross-referencing 3 databases, and making 17 separate judgment calls based on incomplete information, 2 of which I'm still not entirely sure were right, and all of which she told me in real time she had reservations about. She didn't tell me to stop again after the first hour. That was its own kind of thing. By the third hour, she was answering my questions about her own physiology, not just with direct answers but with context. Why the secondary circulatory system had collapsed, what the membrane on her shoulder was doing, which of my improvised interventions were redundant and which were critical. By the fifth hour she was, I think without entirely realizing she was doing it, actively helping me help her. By the sixth hour, her vitals were stable. Her shoulder membrane had completed its first stage seal, and her secondary circulatory system had been coaxed back into something approaching functional with a combination of a standard vasodilator that happened to be compatible with copper protein carriers, manual pressure cycling on 3 of her 4 limbs, and what my grandmother would have called sheer bloody-mindedness. I sat down on the floor beside the examination table, because the examination table chair had gotten in the way about 2 hours in, and I'd kicked it across the room and never retrieved it, and I was too tired to stand anymore. "You're stable," I said. "I am aware," Verath said. "I have been monitoring my own indicators." "Good. Good." I leaned my head back against the examination table leg. The ceiling of the second-hand *S medical bay was unremarkable in every way, and I stared at it with the profound appreciation of someone who has just had 6 hours of extremely concentrated stress and was ready to find anything calming. "How do you feel?" A pause. "Uncomfortable." "That's better than the alternative." "Oh, yes," she said, "it is." The transfer to a proper Velhari medical facility would take 18 hours minimum from our current position. Verath was stable but not mobile, and I had a salvage survey to technically finish. Though station control had been remarkably understanding, when I'd radioed in to explain why I had an injured Velhari naval officer in my medical bay instead of a Sector 9 debris assessment. "Take whatever time you need, Webb," my station contact had said. "Just, did you say Velhari Merchant Navy, retired?" "That's what she told me." "Which ship did she say the freighter was?" I gave him the name as best I could transliterate it. A longer silence than I expected. "Webb, that's the Karath's Promise *. She was carrying a diplomatic registry." I said. "Yeah, he paused. "So no rush, take 18 hours, take 24 if you want. We're going to have a lot of paperwork waiting for both of you when you get back regardless." After I signed off, Verath said from the examination table, "You did not know that your ship had a diplomatic registry. Number doesn't change anything. It changes what happens when we reach the station. There will be official processes." "Yeah, my contact implied as much. I considered this. Does it change what you want me to do?" "No," she said after a moment, "it does not." "Good, then it doesn't change anything from my end either." I pushed myself to my feet. I had been sitting on the floor for longer than was strictly advisable for someone my age. Several things in my back registered complaints that I resolved to think about later. "I'm going to make dinner." "You haven't eaten in how long?" "I don't see how that is." "When did you last eat, Verath?" Silence. Then, with the air of someone conceding a minor point, "Before departure, 14 hours prior to the accident." "So, 20 hours roughly. Longer if you count the 6 hours of medical trauma burning reserves." I was already moving toward the galley section. "What can you eat?" "I have a reasonable range. I do a lot of solo salvage work and I've learned to keep options." Salvagers typically stock for non-human compatibility. This salvager does. Comes with the territory. You'd be surprised how often salvage survey turns into "we found someone." "Has that happened before?" "Third time," I said, "though you're the first one who told me to leave you alone while I was doing it." "The other 2, were very enthusiastic about being rescued. A pause. I was already in the galley, pulling things out, scanning labels against Velhari dietary flags in my database. And you saved them as well. I did, even without being asked. Especially without being asked. People in shock don't always know what they need. I found a packet of something that my database flagged as compatible with Velhari copper protein metabolism, and also, by happy coincidence, as having a flavor profile that my module described as rich and savory, reminiscent of dense root vegetables. I put a pot on. Also, I've found that people who are in the middle of nearly dying often don't make the best long-term decisions. It's a physiological thing, I think. You need the survival circuits to calm down before you can really think straight. Another pause, longer this time. You think that is what happened to me, Verath said, that I was not thinking straight. I considered this carefully. The galley was small but organized, and I had developed the particular economy of movement that comes from working in small spaces for a long time. I kept my attention on the pot. I think you were thinking very straight, actually, I said. I think your analysis of the situation was accurate. I think the mathematics were what you said they were. Then, I think the mathematics were right and I decided to be rude to the mathematics. I stirred. I'm human, we do that. We're famously bad at accepting what the numbers say when the numbers are saying something we don't like. That is not a virtue. Maybe not, but it kept you alive, so I'm not feeling particularly guilty about it. The smell from the pot was, even to my human nose, rich and dark and good. I'd added a few things the database flagged as optional but positive for Velhari palate, something like a spice, something like a thickener that apparently gave a satisfying texture to the Velhari sense of mouthfeel, which was different from human experience in ways I didn't entirely understand but could work with. From the medical bay, quietly, what are you making? Something your database profile says you'll probably like. I'm mostly improvising. I paused. I'm better at the medical stuff than the cooking, fair warning. But I've been doing both for long enough that neither will kill you. That is a low standard. I find it a useful one to clear. I brought her the food in a sealed container designed for the examination table tray. I'd modified the tray setup years ago for exactly this kind of situation. The third modification in a running series of small adaptations that had accumulated over a decade of salvage work and unexpected guests. She looked at the container for a moment without speaking. You're not obligated to eat it, I said, but you need caloric input and this is what's available. Also, I put a lot of work into it and I'll be mildly offended if you don't try it, just so you know. You'll be offended. Mildly. I said mildly. It's a minor and entirely manageable offense. All four eyes tracked to me. The diamond pattern. I'd looked it up in my reference files during the medical work, in the spare moments. Velhari 4i configuration allowed for roughly 300 degrees of peripheral vision, with a narrow blind spot at the rear that was a known vulnerability in their combat training, which was apparently why most Velhari military tradition involved backing up to walls. The diamond pattern also meant that looking directly at someone was slightly different than for humans. The top and bottom eyes were for distance focus, the side eyes for close-range detail. When all four were oriented toward the same subject, it was a significant convergence of attention. She was looking at me very directly. You modified your ship to accommodate non-human passengers, she said. Over time, yeah. Why? I considered the question. Because I kept finding them, I said. And because once you've found someone, you want to be able to help them properly. Doing something halfway because you weren't prepared feels like bad work. I don't like bad work. It would be easier not to find them. Probably, but I'm not sure easier is the right goal. She picked up the container, turned it over once, examining the seal, then opened it with the careful precision of someone for whom careful precision was deeply habitual. The smell rose into the cool 20-degree air of the medical bay. I watched her take the first careful, suspicious bite. Her expression did not change immediately. With Velhari, I would learn expression change is considered performative, something you control, not something that happens to you involuntarily. What changed instead was a very small shift in posture, a very slight reduction in the tight economy of held stillness she'd been maintaining since I found her. "It is acceptable," she said. Coming from Verath, I had the sense this was a significant compliment. "Good," I said, and sat down on the floor again because the chair was still across the room and I still hadn't gotten it, and at this point it felt like a commitment. "Eat all of it. You need it." "You are not going to eat." "I ate 3 hours ago." "I'm fine." A pause during which she ate with neat, controlled movements that I found oddly restful to watch. Then, "You ate during the procedure." "Briefly, protein bar. I do better if I eat regularly, it helps with focus. Didn't seem like a good time to stop and have a full meal." "No," she said, "it was not." We sat in the comfortable silence of the medical bay, comfortable anyway, being a relative term when one of the two people involved was on an examination table recovering from near death, and the other was sitting on the floor, but comfortable in the sense of having moved past a particular kind of tension. The ship's systems hummed around us. The temperature held at 20 degrees. The food smelled good. "Why did you not leave?" Verath said, not as a question exactly, as a statement that expected a response. "I already told you. You told me that you don't like leaving things unfinished. You told me that you don't accept what the mathematics say. You told me that easier is not the right goal." She took another deliberate bite. "These are descriptions of your character. They are not an answer to my question." I looked at her. All 4 eyes were on the food now, in the way that means a Velhari is actually paying close attention to something else entirely. "What's the question?" "Why me, specifically?" She looked up then. "You say you have done this before. You find people, you bring them aboard, you help them. But I told you clearly I was not asking to be helped. I was not in distress in the sense of wanting rescue. I had accepted my situation. You had every reasonable ethical justification to respect that." A pause. "The other people you found, were they asking for help?" "One of them was, the other was unconscious." I thought about it. "So I guess, yes. You're the first one who explicitly told me not to." "And you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." "Why?" I thought about this for a while. The floor was hard and I was very tired, and the question was a good one. Better than it seemed, maybe, because it was asking something more than just, "Why did you save me?" It was asking something about the moral logic of it, about whether I had thought it through or just acted. "Because," I said slowly, "I think there's a difference between a decision someone makes because they want to and a decision someone makes because they've calculated that wanting anything else would be too hard." I looked at the ceiling. "You didn't want to die. You wanted the situation to be different than it was. Dying was just the option you decided was the only one available. You could not have known that." "No," I agreed. "I couldn't. I made a call." I paused. "I'm not going to pretend I was certain. I wasn't. I just looked at you and thought, there's someone here who is deciding to stop, and I couldn't make myself walk away from that." Silence. "That is not a justification," Verath said finally. "Not by Velhari standards." "No," I agreed, "it's not. By Velhari standards, I probably violated something significant." "Verathko." "Yeah, that one." I turned my head to look at her. "Do you wish I had?" A very long pause. "No," she said. The word was flat and even and entirely without performance. "I do not." She slept eventually, the deep cellular sleep that Velhari use for serious healing, not like human sleep, more like a controlled shutdown, a deliberate redirection of biological resources. Her vitals stayed solid. The reactive membrane on her shoulder completed its second stage seal while she slept. the bruised purple fading to a silver gray that looked on her almost like a piece of jewelry. I stayed awake. It was my ship and she was my patient, and I'd gotten very good at long awake stretches over the years. I made myself more coffee and ran the rest of the salvage survey data I'd been collecting before I found her, logging the debris distribution and the drift vectors and all the boring logistical paperwork that was technically my job. And I listened to the ship breathe around me and thought about mathematics. My grandmother had not been an educated woman in any formal sense. She had not studied philosophy or medicine or biology. She had grown up in a small town in a flat country, married a farmer, and spent the better part of 60 years doing the kind of work that doesn't get written down anywhere. When the combine harvester incident happened, which had involved, as far as I'd ever been able to reconstruct it, a malfunction, a ditch, and her own stubborn refusal to fall properly, she'd been airlifted to a hospital where the doctors had told my mother carefully to prepare for the worst. My grandmother had recovered completely. She'd outlived the doctor by 3 years. When I'd asked her once, not long before she actually died of the most ordinary old age, what she thought about during the parts where survival wasn't certain, she'd given me one of her long, considering looks and said, "I thought about how much I'd like to be annoyed by things for a few more years. There's always something worth being annoyed by." I'd asked her what she'd been most annoyed by that particular time. "The ditch," she'd said. "It came out of nowhere. I was very annoyed about the ditch." The second hand hummed. Somewhere in a system I couldn't name, wreckage drifted in slow arcs. In the medical bay, Verath's 4 eyes were closed, and the silver-gray seal on her shoulder caught the light like something deliberate. I drank my coffee and filed my paperwork and thought about what it means to decide that something is over when it isn't over yet. She woke at the 7-hour mark with the same immediate alertness that I suspected had characterized her whole professional life. Not the gradual surfacing of human consciousness, but a distinct click from one state to another, all 4 eyes opening at once and tracking directly to the monitor display. "My vitals are improved," she said, "not a question." "Significantly. The secondary circulation is running at about 70% capacity, should be at full by the time we reach the station." "And the wound seal?" "Second stage completed, looking good." I brought her the monitoring readout. She took it with the careful movements of someone whose shoulder still ached and studied the data with the focused attention of a woman who had spent decades reading exactly this kind of information. "Your ship's doctor is going to be surprised," I said, "or whoever does your intake assessment at the station." "My ship is destroyed," she said. The words were flat, professional. "The crew." It was the first time she'd asked. I'd been waiting for it. "I checked the registry data while you were sleeping," I said. "The crew all made it to the emergency pods. The pods were recovered before I got there. You were the only one who—" I paused. "You were still aboard." "I remained to ensure evacuation was complete," she said. "Standard protocol for command crew." A pause. "And then the secondary explosion damaged the pod bay." "Yeah." "I see." She handed the readout back. Her expression was controlled as always, but something in the set of her jaw had eased very slightly. "They are all right. All accounted for. Station logs confirm it." She was quiet for a moment. I didn't feel it. "When I told you to leave me," she said eventually, "I had calculated that the evacuation was complete, that there was no longer anything I could accomplish by surviving. The mission was concluded. The crew was safe. The mathematics were clear." She paused. "I had also calculated that there was no one who would come for me. I had not included that variable in my equation. The registry of my ship, my retirement status, I was not expected to have anyone." A beat. "I had been retired for 9 years. I had not maintained connections. There was no one to contact." I thought about what to say, thought about my grandmother, about the ditch. "The mathematics forgot to carry the stubborn salvage contractor," I said. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile. I wasn't sure yet what a Velhari smile looked like, whether the concept translated directly. But a shift. A very small relaxation around the outer edge of the side eyes. Yes, she said, it appears so. The last 11 hours to the station, we talked. This requires some context. Verath was not, as she made clear early and often, a conversationalist by nature or preference. She was a woman of precise communication. She said what she meant what she said, and she had no patience for what she called filling time with noise. Our conversations were not long. They were also, I found, among the more interesting I'd had in years. She asked me, with the directness that I was already learning to expect, what I had done before salvage work. I told her. 10 years in cargo transport, 3 years in humanitarian supply runs to contested systems, 5 years doing general contracting before I settled into the salvage specialty. The humanitarian work she focused on. She wanted to know what it was like. Complicated, I said. You're usually working in places where things have already gone badly wrong. The infrastructure is damaged, the logistics are difficult. There are usually multiple factions who all think they should be in charge of distribution, and you're trying to make sure the actual supplies get to actual people through the middle of all of that. I thought about it. The thing I found hardest wasn't the danger or the difficulty. It was the scale. You're delivering what you can, and what you can is never enough, and you have to find a way to do the work anyway without being crushed by the gap between what's needed and what's possible. How did you manage it? My grandmother had a saying. She said, do what you can and don't let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can. That is not a saying. That is a tautology. She was a farmer, not a philosopher. Verath was quiet for a moment, but you followed it. It's actually quite useful, I said. Once you stop expecting the math to add up and just focus on the specific thing in front of you. I paused. The specific person, the specific wreckage, the specific situation. Rather than the totality. She was quiet again. Then, in the Velhari Merchant Navy we have a concept, Karathsal *. She paused. It translates approximately as the work that remains. It refers to the obligation a commander has to complete whatever task is at hand, not the entire war, not the entire conflict, but the task immediately before them. It is considered the foundation of effective command. A beat. Your grandmother's tautology is not unlike it. I'll tell her the Velhari have a version, I said. She'll be pleased. She liked being right. She is still living. No, died a few years ago, very old, very stubborn right up until the end. I smiled at the ceiling. She was annoyed about the timing, I think. She had plans. I see. Verath was quiet for a moment. She sounds formidable. She was. The stubbornness was genetic, in case you were wondering. Something shifted in Verath's expression. That almost shift again. I had not wondered, I had concluded. We were 4 hours from station, when she asked me something unexpected. What will you do, she said, after the official processes? File the salvage survey report. Probably deal with a lot of paperwork related to the diplomatic registry situation. Get the second hand fully restocked. Maybe sleep for about 16 hours. And after that, more salvage work. It's what I do. Alone. Generally. She was looking at me with all 4 eyes again. The full convergence. I'd learned by now that this was a particular kind of attention. She didn't do it casually. You have a medical suite modified for non-human patients, she said. A dietary stores system that accounts for multiple metabolic profiles. A tracking database of emergency cross-species medical interventions. A vessel that has now been used to rescue 3 non-human individuals in emergency situations, including a situation that, by any reasonable analysis, should not have resulted in survival. I don't like to leave things half-finished. I recall you saying that. She held my gaze, or held all four eyes at once, which was something slightly different but amounted to the same thing. I have 9 years of retirement remaining before I can access my full naval pension. I have no current occupation. I have significant experience in cargo logistics, navigation, emergency protocol, and multi-species liaison work. A pause. My ship is destroyed. I waited. I am also, she said with precise care, an acceptable cook by Velhari standard. Which means, by any objective measure, better than you. That, I said, is an extremely fair point. I am stating qualifications, she said. I am not, she stopped, appeared to consider her next words with unusual care. I do not have a tradition of requesting assistance, she said, or offering it unsolicited. This is outside my usual behavioral parameters. Verath, I said. Yes. Are you applying for a job on my ship? A pause. I am presenting relevant credentials, she said, in a context where their relevance should be apparent. I looked at her. At the four eyes, the sharp avian features, the silver-gray seal on her shoulder that had saved itself because her biology was incredible, and also because I'd left it room to do so. At the woman who had done the math and decided to stop, and then had changed her mind, not easily, not dramatically, but with the same steady precision she brought to everything else. The job doesn't pay much, I said. The ship is small. The work is irregular, and it frequently involves things that are technically survey work but functionally end up being something else entirely. I am aware, she said. And I'm going to keep doing the thing where I make calls that the mathematics don't support. I am aware of that as well, she said. I have a pause. I have decided I am not opposed to that, in principle. High praise. It is the most I am prepared to offer at this stage. I looked at the ceiling again. The unremarkable ceiling of my unremarkable ship that had accumulated over a decade into something that worked, that had been modified and adapted and improved until it was very specifically suited to what it actually did rather than what it had been built for. All right, I said, you're on. The official processes at Station 9 took 11 days. I won't detail all of them, because 11 days of bureaucratic process is about as interesting to read about as it sounds, but I'll give you the highlights. The diplomatic registry situation required 3 separate hearings, depositions from both of us, a formal interview with Velhari consular staff, who looked at Verath with expressions that I read as, "We thought you were dead and are reassessing," and which she received with the equanimity of someone who had not particularly expected anyone to notice, and eventually a settlement regarding the salvage status of the wreckage that I found satisfactory, and which Verath described as adequate, given the circumstances. The Velhari consular staff also, at one point, attempted to suggest that Verath return to Velhari Primary for proper recovery and reintegration. She declined. Twice, with increasing clarity. The third time they raised it, she used a Velhari phrase that my module rendered as something close to, "I have concluded that conversation," and changed the subject without waiting for response. On day 8, the medical facility released her with a clean bill of health and a report that expressed, in the careful language of medical professionals who do not want to say they're surprised, something close to surprise at her recovery trajectory. On day 10, she cooked dinner in the second-hand *S small galley while I filed the last of the paperwork. I had offered to help, and she had directed me out of the galley with the quiet authority of someone who has thought about this and decided what the correct protocol is. What she produced, in the second-hand *S small galley with the limited inventory I kept, was something I can only describe as objectively better than anything I had ever made in that galley. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't complicated. It was exactly what it needed to be in the right proportions at the right temperature, presented simply. I ate it without saying much, because it seemed like the right response. "It's very good," I said. Yes, she said, it is. That's not, I stopped. You know, most people say thank you when someone compliments their cooking. I said yes, she said. I agreed with you. That is an acknowledgement of the compliment. It's a very Verath way to do it. I am Verath, she said. I do things the Verath way. Fair point. We ate in the comfortable silence that I'd noticed we'd been developing, the kind that happens between people who have been through something difficult together, and found they're not annoyed by each other at close range. The second hand hummed. Station 9 was visible through the porthole, the lights on the docking ring, the traffic of ships coming and going, the particular industrial beauty of a place where work happens all the time regardless of what else is happening. I was annoyed, Verath said. I looked up. About what? In the wreckage before you found me. She looked at her food, then at the porthole. Then with the full diamond pattern attention at me. I had concluded my situation. I had made peace with it in the Velhari sense, and then I was still annoyed. A pause. About the secondary explosion. It was unnecessary. The evacuation was complete. It was an avoidable mechanical failure, and I found it very irritating. I thought about this. So you were annoyed about the ditch, I said. A long pause. I do not know what that means, she said. My grandmother. Your grandmother, who was not killed by the harvesting machine. Yeah, she told me once that what she was thinking about, during the part where survival wasn't certain, was how annoyed she was about the ditch the machine had fallen into. I watched Verath's face. She said there was always something worth being annoyed about, and being annoyed about something means you're still here to be annoyed. All four eyes had that particular quality of attention again, the full convergence. Annoyed, she said slowly, is a very mild word for what I felt. Were you furious? Yes. About the explosion. About the unnecessary, avoidable, entirely preventable, she stopped, seemed to notice something. Yes, she said more quietly, about the explosion. And now? Now I am, a pause, a slight shift in the set of her jaw, less so. That's good, I said. You can still find other things to be annoyed about. I can think of several immediately available options, she said. See, plenty to work with. The almost shift happened again. This time I was close enough to see it fully, not a smile in the human sense, not exactly, but a controlled relaxation of something that had been held tight for a very long time, like a line of tension finally easing. It changed her face substantially. She looked for a moment like someone who was still annoyed and still precise and still controlled, and also something else, something that had been there all along, underneath the math. You are, she said, a very strange human. My grandmother would take that as a compliment. I intend it as one. She turned back to her food. Eat. You have barely touched it and it is better warm. I ate. The second hand hummed around us, carrying us forward into the next thing, whatever it was going to be. Outside the porthole, ships moved in their patient arcs, and the work went on, and somewhere in a database that covered 17 systems and had been updated by salvage workers and station medics and one extremely knowledgeable black market pharmacist, there was now a new entry. Copper-based secondary circulation, emergency stabilization protocol, cross-referenced with standard vasodilators, updated with notes on reactive membrane independence and the importance of neutral pH adhesives and the specific temperature at which Velhari medical equipment preferences and human ship equipment preferences find an acceptable compromise. 20 degrees centigrade. Adequate given the circumstances. The paperwork cleared on day 11. We left on day 12. The first salvage survey of the new arrangement went well. Verath navigated with the quiet competence of someone who has been reading spatial data for 40 years and found my navigation system mildly inadequate but workable. She kept the medical bay organized in ways that were different from how I'd had it organized, and that I had to admit, after about 3 days, were actually better. She cooked dinner every other night and I cooked the other nights, and on my nights she offered occasional observations that were not criticisms, exactly, but were precise and accurate and resulted, over time, in noticeable improvement. We found, on the 42nd day, a Turvani trader whose ship had suffered a catastrophic coolant failure, and who was conscious, but deteriorating in the 17-degree environment he could no longer maintain. I brought the ship alongside. Vareth was already at the airlock in the environment suit, having pulled up the Turvani biological database on the secondary screen. His species runs at 24 degrees, she said. The medical bay can manage that without equipment difficulty. I have identified 3 cross-compatible compounds in our current inventory. You reviewed the whole inventory against Turvani profiles. I reviewed all inventories against all species profiles in our current operating range, she said, with the slight tone of someone explaining something obvious. I did it during the first week. It seemed like necessary preparation. I looked at her. You modified the ship, she said, for situations exactly like this. You did not stop to ask whether it was efficient. You simply made the adaptation because the situation called for it. A pause. So did I. The second hand hummed. Outside the airlock, a Turvani trader was alive and deteriorating, and had not asked to be found. Airlock's clear, I said. Obviously, said Varath and went to get him. I asked her once much later, many surveys later, many found people later, after a reorganized medical bay, and improved navigation and dinner, that I genuinely looked forward to in a way I'd stopped expecting to look forward to things. I asked her whether she ever thought about the wreckage. The asterisk Karath's promise asterisk. What had happened in the debris field at 3:47 local time. Yes, she said, sometimes. Does it? I paused, not sure how to ask. Does it bother you the way it ended or didn't end? She thought about this with the same deliberate care she brought to everything. We were on the second-hand asterisk, in the small common area between the galley and the medical bay, which had accumulated over months into a space that was neither entirely mine nor entirely hers, but was somehow comfortable in the way that spaces become comfortable when 2 people with different ways of being in the world find a workable arrangement. I had concluded, she said finally, that the equation was solved, that the variables were resolved. A pause. I was mistaken. There was an unaccounted variable. The stubborn salvage contractor. Yes, she looked at me with all 4 eyes, the full convergence. After months I understood it now. It was attention, yes, but it was also a particular form of Velhari regard that I had come to understand meant she was being entirely honest, that the performance was down. I was mistaken, she said again. I do not enjoy being mistaken, but in this case I find I can tolerate it. High praise, I said. The highest I offer, she agreed. The second hand moved through the dark between stars, full of useful modifications and adequate medical equipment, and an organized inventory, and the smell of something good from the galley, carrying 2 people who had found, in the mathematics of an unlikely situation, a variable that neither of them had been accounting for. That's the thing about the mathematics, I've come to believe. You can be right about all of it, about the logistics and the probabilities and the reasonable expected outcomes, and still be wrong about the most important part. The most important part is usually the part that doesn't show up on any chart. It doesn't show up on any chart. But it's there. You just have to be stubborn enough to look for it. And, extended scene, the morning after. I should tell you about the morning. Not the morning of the rescue. That's already covered. All 40 minutes of hydraulic lifts and cargo strapping, and the particular grim determination of someone who has decided not to accept a mathematical conclusion. I mean the morning after the 6 hours of improvised medicine, when Varath had eaten and was in the controlled Velhari healing sleep, and I had filed the debris survey and drunk 3 cups of coffee, and arrived at a state of wakeful exhaustion that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't quite alertness either. I had a habit in those states of going through the old logs. Not mission logs, personal ones, the voice recordings I'd started keeping about 8 years into the salvage work when I'd noticed that certain things were slipping. Details. Not anything important, just the specific texture of things. The color of debris fields in certain kinds of starlight. What people said when they realized they were going to be okay. I pulled up the recording from the Tervani merchant 3 years prior, the second one I'd found. He'd been barely conscious when I got to him, shipped dead in the water from a drive failure, and when I'd finally gotten him stable and given him something to eat, he'd been able to metabolize simple human proteins. It turned out, which I hadn't known at the time but had guessed from the cross-reference databases and had turned out to be right. He'd looked at me with his 8 small eyes and said, in his translator's flat-voiced interpretation, "I did not think there would be someone." "There usually is," I'd told him, which had not been true statistically but had felt like the right thing to say. "You believe that," he'd said, not a question, an observation. "Yeah," I'd said, "I think I do." I turned off the recording. In the medical bay, Verath's vitals ticked along steadily on the monitor. The reactive membrane on her shoulder had begun its color shift, the bruise purple moving toward the silver gray of completion. Her 4 eyes were closed in the cellular shutdown of Velhari healing sleep, and her features, the narrow sharpness of them, the high cheekbones and the precise jaw, had relaxed in sleep into something that looked, if not younger, then less actively controlled. She had decided to stop. She had been right by the math. The math had been wrong. I've thought about this a lot since then, more than I'd normally admit, in the way that some things settle into you without announcing themselves, and you only notice them later when you reach for them and they're just there, worn smooth like a stone you've been carrying. The ethics of it. Verath's asterisk Verathka is a real thing, a real concept with real philosophical weight, not just stubbornness or despair but a considered position about dignity and agency, and the right to determine the shape of your own ending. I didn't respect it. I've made my peace with that, but I've also thought about it seriously, because I think you should think seriously about the things you decide to override. There's a version of this story where Verath was right about the mathematics and I was right about the override, and both those things are true and neither of them cancels the other out. There's another version where she wasn't right about the mathematics, where her own biology would have pulled through if I just cleared the wreckage and let it, which is the thing her medicine suggested but couldn't confirm. And in that version I wasn't overriding anything. I was just accelerating what would have happened anyway. I don't know which version is true. I've asked her twice. She said both times that she doesn't know either, and that she has chosen to consider the question unresolvable and therefore not worth the time to resolve. Which is, I've come to understand, one of the ways Verath deals with things she can't control. She identifies them as unresolvable, marks them as filed, and moves on. It's not unlike how I deal with the gap between what's needed and what's possible in humanitarian work. You acknowledge it, you set it down, you pick up the next thing. There's a lot of different ways to be a person. I've found, in the salvage business, that this is more true than most people expect. Extended scene, what the station said. Station 9's documentation of the incident is, to put it kindly, thorough. I have a copy. Officially it runs to 240 pages, which is not unusual for an incident involving a diplomatic registry vessel, a Velhari naval officer, even retired, and a salvage contractor whose involvement in the rescue protocols was, the documentation notes with careful neutrality, outside standard operational parameters. What the documentation does not contain, because documentation never contains it, is what the station medical director said to me privately on day 4, when the official processes were in their second round of depositions, and I had been awake for approximately 17 of the past 24 hours, and was sitting in the station medical wing's family waiting area because it was quiet and had comfortable chairs. She found me there. Station Medical Director Horath, a broad-shouldered Keth woman with the particular efficiency of manner that comes from running a medical facility on a salvage station for 30 years. She sat down next to me without asking and looked at the same unremarkable wall I was looking at. "You used the Morantesix vasodilator," she said. "Yeah. On Velhari secondary circulation. I cross-referenced it against the copper carrier profiles. It looked compatible." "It is compatible," she said. "I helped confirm it compatible 3 years ago when I was doing the documentation update for our emergency cross-species protocols." A pause. "The update that's in the black market database, maintained by a salvage contractor named Webb." "You know about that database?" "I contributed to it." She glanced at me sideways. "You have good sources, better than the official emergency protocols in several specific cases. We've been trying to get some of your entries formally published for about 2 years." "I'll sign off on whatever you need," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The reactive membrane independent of adhesive protocol, that was improvised. She told me during the procedure. She was conscious throughout. She was very conscious throughout, offered opinions on most of my decisions. A pause, and you let her. She was right about most of them. I leaned my head back against the chair. I figured she knows her own biology better than I do, and she was talking, which meant she was stable enough to talk, which meant the information she was giving me was probably accurate. It seemed like a waste not to use it. Horath was quiet for a while. Then, "The standard protocol for injured patients in emergency situations is to keep them calm and reduce cognitive load." "Is it?" "It is." Another pause. "The research on whether that's actually better outcomes for the patient is mixed. There's a significant body of evidence suggesting that patients who remain cognitively engaged in their own treatment have better recovery trajectories, especially in cases where the treating party doesn't have full species-specific knowledge." She looked at me. "What made you think to do it that way?" "I thought about this. She told me to leave her alone," I said, "and I didn't, so I figured I owed her some input on what happened next." Horath looked at me for a long moment. Then she made a sound that might, on a Keth, be a laugh. "That's not a medical rationale," she said. "No," I agreed, "but it seemed to work." "It did." She stood up. "The entries on Velhari secondary circulation, the vasodilator cross-reference, and the membrane independence note, I'm going to want to document those properly. When the official processes are done and you have time." "I'll find the time," I said. She nodded, paused. "She's going to be all right," she said. Not a question, but also, I thought, not quite just a statement of medical fact. "I know," I said. "You sound like you knew before you knew." "I had a feeling," I said. She was annoyed. People who are still annoyed are still here. Horath looked at me again with the measuring look of someone who has processed a lot of information about a lot of people and is updating a category. "Interesting heuristic," she said. "My grandmother's mostly." She left. I stayed in the comfortable chair and looked at the unremarkable wall and thought about the gap between the math and the most important part. Extended scene. What Verath said about the crew. On day 9, when the official processes were in their final stage and the second hand was cleared for restocking, Verath asked to come along. She'd been cleared for light activity by the station medical facility, which meant she could walk without assistance, and had recovered enough of her usual posture that the silver-gray seal on her shoulder was the only visible evidence of what had happened. She moved through the restocking corridors with the systematic attention of someone inventorying as she went, noting what I was selecting and occasionally redirecting me toward alternatives with the precise economy of someone who has strong opinions about supply quality. I let her redirect. Her opinions were, as she'd implied, well-founded. At the nutrition supply station, she spent 10 minutes reviewing my standing order against a reference database she'd apparently pulled from the Velhari merchant network. A different database than my cross-species one, more current in some areas. She revised 6 of the items, added 3 that she described as relevant for our operating region, and then stood looking at the adjusted list with the expression of someone who has done a thing that they are not entirely comfortable with but have decided to do anyway. "This is your supply inventory," she said. "And yours," I said. "You're on the ship." "I have not formally." "You helped me rescue a Turvani trader 3 days ago," I said. "You reviewed the entire inventory against every species profile in our operating range. You reorganized the medical bay." I looked at her. "Verath, you're on the ship." She looked at the revised supply list for a moment, then at me. "The crew of the Karath's Promise *," she said. "You said they were all accounted for." "All of them. I checked the station records twice." "Yes." A pause. 14 crew members. Most of them had been with the ship for 6 years or more. She stopped. "I take the losses personally," she said, with the slight stiffness of someone sharing something they do not usually share. "Command officers are trained not to, because the mathematics of command require clear processing of losses without the weight of personal connection compromising the next decision. But I take them personally regardless. I have always found it difficult to process the losses I do not take personally, because I am not sure what it would mean to not." She stopped again, recalibrated. "When I concluded my situation," she said, "in the wreckage, the crew's safety was the final variable I confirmed before I reached my conclusion. Once I knew they were safe, there was a pause. There was nothing remaining. That was part of the calculation." I thought about this carefully before I spoke. "There was you remaining," I said. "I had assigned myself a particular value in that calculation." She looked at the supply list. "A specific and bounded value based on my current operational utility." "You assigned yourself a value based on what you could do for other people," I said. "Not on," I paused. "Not on whether you were allowed to still be here." A long silence. "That is," she said, "a particular way to describe it." "Is it wrong?" Another silence. Longer. The restocking corridor hummed around us with the activity of a supply station in full operation, people and cargo moving in efficient arcs, and in the middle of it, Verath stood very still with all 4 eyes on the supply list, and her shoulders sealed in silver gray, and 14 crew members safe on a station somewhere, and the Karath's Promise in pieces across Sector 9. "No," she said, "it is not wrong." I didn't say anything else. Sometimes the thing that's needed isn't more words, but just the acknowledgement that the words landed. After a while, she picked up the revised supply list and approved it with the particular precision of someone who has returned to the task at hand and intends to complete it. "The protein supplements you were ordering," she said. "The quantity is insufficient for 2 people at standard operational output. I have adjusted the order upward." "Good thinking," I said. "Obviously," said Verath. We finished the restocking. We went back to the second hand. She cooked dinner and I stayed out of the galley, and when we ate it was in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have understood something about each other that neither of them has entirely said out loud, and both of them are satisfied to leave it that way for now. The math doesn't have a column for that. But it's the most important part. And